Origin Series. Part 5, The Hittites and the Iron Age Dawn. Chapters 1 to 8. Circa 1650 to 1180 BC. Introduction. There is a people mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, Uriah the Hittite, husband of Bathsheba, the daughters of Heth, the Hittite kings listed among Solomon's trading partners, whose identity was, for centuries, a complete mystery. No one knew who the Hittites were. No physical trace of their civilization had been found. Then, in 1906, excavations at a remote site in north-central Anatolia, modern Bagazkoy in Turkey, uncovered a royal archive of over 30,000 clay tablets. Within a decade, a Czech scholar named Bedřich Rosny had cracked the language. It was not Semitic. It was not Sumerian. It was Indo-European, related to Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and ultimately to English. The Hittites had been hiding in plain sight. This is their story, the forgotten superpower of the ancient world. Chapter 1. Who were the Hittites? The Hittites were an Indo-European people who arrived in Anatolia around 2000 BC, gradually absorbing the existing Hattic-speaking population whose name and some of whose culture they adopted. They built their capital at Hattusa, a rocky plateau in north-central Turkey at over 1,000 meters elevation, and over the following centuries built one of the great empires of the ancient world. What makes the Hittites so fascinating is not just their power but their complexity. Their royal archive was written in up to 8 languages: Hittite, Luwian, Hattic, Hurrian, Akkadian, Sumerian, and others. Their empire was genuinely multilingual and administratively sophisticated. Their law code, which we will examine shortly, was in many respects more humane than anything else from the ancient Near East. By 1300 BC, the Hittites were one of 5 great powers of the Late Bronze Age, alongside Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and Mitanni. They corresponded with Egyptian pharaohs on terms of equality, calling each other Great King and Brother, exchanging gifts, arranging royal marriages. The Amarna letters, found in Egypt, preserve this extraordinary diplomatic world in intimate detail. Rosny's discovery in 1915 that Hittite was Indo-European was one of the great moments in the history of scholarship. It connected the ancient Near East to the ancestors of the Greeks, the Romans, and ultimately to the languages spoken across most of Europe and South Asia today. Chapter 2. Old and New Kingdoms. The Old Hittite Kingdom, beginning around 1650 BC, was an era of expansion and internal turbulence. Hittite kings campaigned as far as Syria, clashing with the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni. But the succession to the throne was never stable. Hittite kings were murdered by brothers, nephews, and sons with disturbing regularity. The most dramatic illustration of this instability came with Mursili I, who led the raid on Babylon in 1595 BC that ended the Old Babylonian Empire. He returned home to be murdered by his brother-in-law. His assassination triggered a century of chaos that nearly destroyed the Hittite state entirely, what scholars call the Middle Kingdom, a period of contraction and internal conflict. The New Kingdom, beginning around 1400 BC, was a different story. A new dynasty reasserted control, defeated Mitanni, and extended Hittite power throughout Anatolia and into Syria. The peak came under Suppiluliuma I, who ruled from around 1344 BC and who transformed the Hittites into a genuine superpower. Suppiluliuma I destroyed Mitanni so thoroughly that it effectively ceased to exist as an independent state. He extended Hittite power to the Lebanon range and created a network of vassal states that stretched from the Aegean to northern Mesopotamia. He was, by any measure, one of the most effective rulers of the ancient world. And then came a letter from Egypt. The widow of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, possibly Ankhesenamun, though the identity is debated, wrote to Suppiluliuma requesting a Hittite prince as her husband. She wrote, frightened. She did not want to marry one of her own servants. Suppiluliuma, suspicious, sent emissaries to investigate. They confirmed the request was genuine. He sent a prince. The prince died on the journey to Egypt, possibly murdered. We will never know the full story. But it is one of the most dramatic documents in ancient diplomacy. Chapter 3: The Battle of Kadesh. In 1274 BC, the two greatest powers of the ancient world met in battle at a site called Kadesh, on the Orontes River in what is now Syria. It was the largest chariot battle in recorded history, an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 chariots on each side. And it is the first battle in history that we can reconstruct in tactical detail from both sides of the conflict. Rameses II of Egypt had marched north with his army in 4 divisions, to challenge the Hittite king Muwatalli II for control of Syria. Hittite intelligence agents posed as deserters and fed Rameses false information. The Hittite army was far away. Rameses advanced with only the lead division, leaving the others strung out behind him on the road. The Hittite chariotry burst from hiding. They hit the second Egyptian division, scattered it, and swept around to attack Rameses's camp. The pharaoh was nearly encircled. What happened next is heavily dependent on which source you believe. The Egyptian version, carved on the walls of 5 temples, including Karnak and Abu Simbel, in the poem of Pentor, describes Rameses rallying his bodyguard, calling on the god Amun, and single-handedly turning the battle. He is heroic beyond human capacity. It is masterful propaganda. The Hittite version records a more modest reality. Neither side won. Both retreated. Both claimed victory. The battle ended in a costly draw that neither could afford to repeat. And 16 years later, in 1259 BC, the two powers did something remarkable: they signed a peace. Chapter 4: The World's First Peace Treaty. The Egyptian-Hittite Peace Treaty of 1259 BC is the oldest surviving international peace treaty in history. 2 copies exist, the Egyptian version carved on temple walls at Karnak and the Ramesseum, and a Hittite version preserved as a clay tablet copy of the original silver document, found at Hattusa. The 2 versions largely agree. The treaty establishes non-aggression between the 2 empires, mutual military assistance against third-party attackers, extradition of political refugees, and a guarantee of fair treatment for those returned. It is, in other words, a recognizably modern diplomatic document, with clauses that would not look out of place in a 21st-century international agreement. A replica of the treaty, based on the Hittite version held in Istanbul's Archaeological Museum, hangs in the corridor outside the United Nations Security Council chamber in New York. It is displayed as the founding document of international law and diplomacy. The oldest peace treaty in the world is still, in some sense, in force. The treaty was sealed by a royal marriage. The Hittite princess became one of Rameses II's wives. The correspondence surrounding the arrangement, letters about dowries, travel preparations, royal gifts, gives us an intimate glimpse of ancient diplomacy at the highest level. Chapter 5: Hittite Society and Religion. The Hittites were, in many ways, the most interesting people in the ancient Near East. Their religion alone repays study. They boasted, with pride, not embarrassment, of 1,000 gods. Every people they conquered brought their gods with them into the Hittite pantheon. Hattic gods, Hurrian gods, Mesopotamian gods, Luwian gods, all found a place. The Hittite state religion was one of the most inclusive in the ancient world. At its head was the storm god, known in Hittite as Tahuna, cognate with the Norse Thor and the Celtic Tyrannes. He was depicted as a warrior standing on a bull, hurling lightning. His consort was the sun goddess of Arina, the supreme goddess of the Hittite state. Their relationship structured the divine universe. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, 2 kilometers from Hattusa, preserves the most extraordinary monument of Hittite religion. Carved into natural rock outcroppings, a procession of 63 gods marches in 2 lines, identified by cuneiform signs beside them. At the point where the 2 processions meet, the storm god and the sun goddess face each other. It is one of the most impressive religious sites to survive from the Bronze Age, still visible in the Turkish landscape today. Hittite law is also remarkable. The Hittite law code uses fines and restitution rather than physical mutilation for most offenses, a striking contrast to the eye for an eye principle of Babylonian law. Killing a slave requires financial compensation to the owner. Accidental injury requires modest payment. Even accidental homicide by a third party is treated with relative leniency. By the brutal standards of the ancient world, this is a humane legal tradition. Chapter 6 Iron, the Hittite secret weapon? For generations, historians told a compelling story. The Hittites had a monopoly on iron smelting technology and used it as a military secret weapon, which explains their military dominance. It was a satisfying narrative. It was also largely wrong. The Hittites did work iron. A letter from a Hittite king declining to send iron to a foreign ruler survives, though scholars debate whether the refusal was diplomatic, logistical, or technical. But iron weapons were rare luxury items throughout the Bronze Age, not standard military equipment. Tutankhamun's tomb contained an iron dagger, treasure, not a soldier's tool. The technology existed, but the widespread adoption had not yet happened. The real transition from bronze to iron came after the Bronze Age collapse, not during the Hittite Empire. And it was driven not by Hittite secrecy but by the disruption of the tin trade. Bronze requires tin, which came from distant Afghanistan, possibly from Britain, or from Anatolian sources. When the Bronze Age trade networks collapsed around 1200 BC, the tin supply dried up. Iron ore, by contrast, is found almost everywhere. The Iron Age happened because people had no choice. The Hittite homeland of Anatolia did become a major ironworking region in the early Iron Age, and the Neo-Hittite states that survived the collapse transmitted this technology westward to the Greeks. In that indirect sense, the Hittite association with iron contains a grain of truth. But the legend of the secret weapon is mostly later myth-making. Chapter 7, The Collapse and the Legacy. The end of the Hittite Empire came swiftly and mysteriously. Around 1200 BC, the last Hittite king Suppiluliuma II, not to be confused with his more famous namesake, was desperately requesting grain shipments. Letters describe enemy ships attacking Hittite coastal cities. The Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders from the Aegean, were attacking on multiple fronts. The grain stores were empty. The army could not be fed. Around 1180 BC, Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The palace was looted, the temples set alight. The population vanished, died, fled, or dispersed. The city was never reoccupied. One of the greatest empires of the ancient world simply ceased to exist, within what appears to have been a single generation. We do not know who did it. Possibly the Sea Peoples. Possibly internal revolt. Possibly a combination of pressures that no single empire could have survived. The Bronze Age collapse, the subject of Origins Part 7, engulfed the Hittites along with almost everything else. But the Hittites did not entirely disappear. Neo-Hittite city-states, Karshemish, Malaysia, Hama, survived in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria for several more centuries, continuing Hittite artistic and administrative traditions. These are the Hittites mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. The Uriah who died in David's wars. The daughters of Heth. The trading partners of Solomon. Shadows of a great empire, still present in the world 2 centuries after Hattusa burned. Chapter 8, Sources and Further Reading. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty is preserved in Istanbul's Archaeological Museum and in the temple inscriptions at Karnak. Gary Beckman's Hittite diplomatic texts is the essential scholarly edition. The treaty replica at the United Nations was installed in 2005. For the Hittites generally, Trevor Bryce's The Kingdom of the Hittites is the definitive modern study, thorough, readable, an essential. Oliver Gurney's The Hittites, first published in 1952 and updated several times, remains a superb introduction. Harry Hoffner's The Laws of the Hittites is the scholarly edition of the Law Code. For the Battle of Kadesh, Hans Godek's edited volume Perspectives on the Battle of Kadesh assembles the key scholarly essays. Alan Gardner's The Kadesh Inscriptions of Ramesses II gives the Egyptian sources in detail. On iron, Jane Waldbaum's From Bronze to Iron and R.F. Tilecoat's A History of Metallurgy provide the technical context. The Hittite monopoly theory is effectively dismantled in both. End of Origin Series Part 5.